things all set up here. So again, we're looking at the idea of, okay, the stream's up for you. That's great. Yeah, I wasn't quite sure if the stream was working. So I had reset it. Thank you for live chat. So let's pick it up again. So the idea being around media effects, and we've got the Douglas Adams quote there, basically setting up the impact that a disruption can have on media engagement. So again, to quote from Adams, anything that is in the world when you're born is normal and ordinary and is just a natural part of the way the world works. Anything that's invented between when you're 15 and 35 is exciting and revolutionary, and you're probably going to get a career in it. Anything invented after you're 35 is against the natural order of things. And again, it's just setting up that idea of how does a moral panic work? It's often around something that's perceived to be a disruption, or if we have a look at some examples from the past, for instance, we can see in the past comic books have been linked to concerns in the 1930s and 50s around a delinquent youth culture. So the idea being here that Frederick Wortham established this kind of study, linking really loosely at the time a connection between violence that was represented in comics and horror, and an effect it was having on readers, and that he argued there was a causal link between your Batman comic and also disruptive delinquent behavior. So what's interesting to me about the 1950s moral panic is that there's been a number of articles which have since looked over this research. There's a great one here from IO9. If you have a look, just type in the headline, How One Man's Lies Almost Destroyed the Comic Industry, actually looking at the data that Frederick Wortham used when he was mounting his argument that Batman comics in the 1950s led to juvenile delinquency, and actually he misrepresented the data. He extrapolated from a very, very small sample set of delinquent youth and troubled youth that he interviewed when he was a psychologist, and misrepresented that data, claiming there were much more occurring than was actually happening. And we had a little look at that last week in terms of video games and violence. Many people point to and cherry pick titles that are, from their point of view, emblematic of a problem of video games and violence. Like you might think of America's Army, for instance, saying that this is a kind of military recruitment tool. But then you've really got to look at the data. How representative is America's Army of the actual video gaming experience? How many people play it? What's its critical reaction? How's it's been received in the gaming community? And once you start asking a lot of these questions, you quickly realize some of the texts which are being pointed to as bad and evil and disruptive and having a media effect on someone are just not representing the actual reality of video gaming. That is, as we saw last week, you could look at a different text like Valiant Hearts, which depicts World War One, and here we have a text that still represents violence, where it's set during trench warfare during World War One, but it involves a depiction of violence through which many games critics have pointed to you actually gain a very sophisticated empathy towards how violence works. So again, the idea being that we really need to make sure, for those that are arguing there's an effect structure, we look at the data and we ask how representative of the actual experience. Are these popular titles? Are these titles a lot of people engage with? And are a lot of people reading it the way they are said? So we'll push forward and see how we can go through the rest of this material. I know that, thanks Silent Him for flagging that, Twitch looks like it's a little buggy today, so we'll see how we go. I'll make sure I'm recording this as well. Thanks for the reminder, actually. I'll just make sure I'm making an independent recording, just so I can put this up on the site. So, the other spaces where we see this narrative of media effect is Dungeons & Dragons, the video nasties phenomenon in the UK. So Dungeons & Dragons, if we start with that first, equally got caught up with the idea that it could be a pathway to Satanism. In fact, one of Tom Hanks's first movies was a moral panic narrative where he played a troubled teen playing D&D and losing grips on reality and fiction. So the idea being here that the role-playing game D&D could lead to a dissociation of reality or various other concerns. Basically boiling down to this media product, a role-playing game, will have a negative effect. Video nasties equally during the 80s, the sense that a number of murders were committed, and those that committed them linked it to the texts they watched, Evil Dead and so forth. Heavy metal music. You're right, I think I've chosen that image because it's the kind of idea of backtracking that, so obviously that image from the heavy metal image on the bottom left-hand corner, the words are flipped and reversed, right? So, here we have a metal band and it's do drugs. And the idea being there was this period in the 70s where people were, researchers who were claiming that media was having an effect, a negative effect, would argue that there's backtracking going on in some of these titles, which are kind of proof of a malicious intent. And what I want to do is step back from that argument to instead hopefully characterize a more interesting debate. So there are two readings. You can look them up later as additional ones if you're interested. On one hand, we've got Anderson, right? So Anderson, in the mid-2000s, late end of the 2010s, came out with this FAQs on violent video games and other media violence. He's basically a very atypical voice around flagging concerns around video game violence leading to real violence. On the other hand, we have Henry Jenkins's piece on Reality Bites, 8 Myths about Video Game Debunked. So, both of them are providing a nice list of things to hopefully, for us to think about a bit in today's chat around it. So, like last week, we kind of set the scene up. Why is it interesting to look at video games? Well, video games are big business at the moment, as we can see with articles like this one from the ABC way back in 2013. Video games are really charting as the entertainment industry cash cow, right? So here we have Grand Theft Auto sets record as sales zoom past 1 billion. Of course, it's far exceeded that now. But that was really a benchmark in terms of the fact that this game, its first day sales alone, were blowing conventional media out of the water in terms of, the box office receipts for cinema and books. Really, through examples like this is shown as not being where it's at, right? Video games are really being seen here as where most of the money is coming from, where all the benchmarks are being set for entertainment properties. But within that, we have this idea that also there's been stories around linking video games broadly to concerns around violence. Even like, I guess I chose this example because I think it's such an innocuous one. Minecraft being linked to school violence. And that I guess that's a bit of a cherry-picked article from my behalf, but it is an interesting one in terms of showing how something that's defined as a video game can suddenly I noticed the stream might be a bit lagging at the moment. No, it's working. Of course, Minecraft's an interesting one because, of course, the creators of Minecraft and the current owners of it are working hard to work with schools and so forth to use it as a entry point into learning about architecture and various other things. But yeah, nevertheless, Minecraft, like this example, still gets caught up in debates around media effects. If it works. Yes, so here we go. So the next clip, so the idea that the father in the top sequence saying, oh, look at Henry making worlds using his imagination and old building blocks, and then reacting to Minecraft on the computer being, witchcraft and repent. And again, that's kind of harkening back to the Douglas Adams quote that, is the media effect issue really something about the person, that is the kid that's playing it, or is it about the adult in this case and their own generational mismatch, right? Their own sense of not being able to understand or control simply the new environment. In this case, moving from Legos or building blocks, which the parent understands, to computers, which is a space of not understanding, and maybe within that wanting to have rules around it. So again, violence in video games. So a couple of articles there about violence and so forth. Target pulling Grand Theft Auto because of concerns around its violence. Mass Effect. Anyway, and that's all setting the scene for the debate, which I want to spend a little bit of time just running over now in terms of some of the key points that we can look at around it. So if we skip to the next slide, the 4 key things I want to quickly cover are understanding the differences between Anderson and Jenkins's perspectives on video game violence, gaining an understanding of the potential consequences of video games through both those points of view. Consequences not only in terms of, it'll lead to something bad, but also consequence in terms of an entry point into actually gaining knowledge, right? Video games as a pathway of professionalization or of career development or of literacy development, right? So again, playing with that idea of an effect to say it's a positive effect as well as some of the concerns around negatives. Thirdly, discuss the ways in which virtual worlds can shape understanding and behavior. And finally, applying these concepts to parental and regulatory reactions. All media effect often comes down and boils down to policy debates, right? So Australia has a classification scheme for all entertainment properties. What's really interesting is how video games really disrupt that, G rating, PG, M, MA, R rating. Because not only do you have the game, but you have DLC, you have modding, and you have so much paratext, right? Ancillary media content. In addition to the mothership property of the Minecraft game, right? You'll have all of the mods. You'll have, for other games DLC. How do you police that? How do you have to individually re-rate every DLC and so forth? So again, there's a lot of policy considerations, which I think this ultimately is wrapped up in. So here is an image of Anderson, who's an expert on effect in violence in TV and film. Now, he based his work on research around, in this case, I want to look at specifically around video games, and he holds the position that video games prompt young people towards even more aggression and violence than they do other media content. So, he's arguing that, while he has concerns about comic books and movies and TV, video games, much more than any other media content and platform, can prompt young people towards even more aggressive and violent behavior. All right, so he's kind of much like the previous South Australian Attorney General, who argued that we can't have an R rating for video games because video games are just too immersive and are going to trigger way too much from a gamer. Anderson's saying something similar in terms of, video games is just such a different thing than other spaces. And, it is a fair point. Video games, the idea being that if you think of, I remember there's one quote that, to understand video games, you have to understand the player of the video game as the last point in the assembly line, right? That unlike a movie or a film, which can get completed and is then distributed, the game really only happens ultimately when it's played, right? You have to actually interact with it to get it to move along. You can't just sit there and watch it. You need to be actively participating. So, a quote from Anderson that I want to read is the idea that, quote from Anderson, the 14-year-old boy arguing that he has played violent video games for years and has not ever killed anybody is absolutely correct in rejecting the extreme, necessary, and sufficient position, as is the 45-year-old 2-pack-a-day cigarette smoker who notes that he still does not have lung cancer, but both are wrong in inferring that their exposure to the respective risk factors, violent media, cigarettes, has not causally increased the likelihood that they and the people around them will one day suffer the consequences of that risky behavior. Right? So basically, the quote boils down to him saying, you could get a 14-year-old kid saying, I play violent video games every day and I don't feel violent. And he's saying it's akin to the smoker who says, I smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day and I don't feel sick. His argument is that both those positions are flawed because both of them still are risk behaviors, right? Again, you could say it's a glass half full type perspective in terms of presuming a very pessimistic space. Against that point of view, I want to talk about Jenkins and his 8 myths of this idea of a video game media effect. So Jenkins tackles a broader array of misconceptions about the impact of video games on society. He argues that the primary audience is really not children, right? So Anderson's mainly concerned with this idea of children and youth, and that they are taking risk behaviors in playing video games, which should just be removed. Jenkins says it's not the case because it's really, again, if you look at the data, kids don't form the bulk of the overall video gaming population, right? He says maybe 20 years ago that was the case, but Jenkins' argument is that primary audience isn't children. Violence is not increasing in society if you look at the data, and that is if you look at police statistics reporting crime. It's not as if now that video games are more popular, there's been a proportionate increase in crime. So he says those statistics don't hold up, and that concerns about isolation, desensitization, and violence are overblown. That is, they're cherry picking and they're not representative of the average experience and the mainstream experience. So a quote from Jenkins here, he says, "Everything I know about media as a media scholar who studied media for over 20 years, media is most influential when it reaffirms our existing structure or belief." So a bit of an echo chamber, right? So when media kind of endorses and represents what you already believe, then you'll cite it and you'll spread it and you'll Facebook post it or something. Jenkins goes on to say, media is least influential when it changes our behavior, right? Or attempts to change our behavior, right? Just say no to drugs, these kind of public health campaigns. It can be difficult if your behavior isn't already aligned to that and you don't already agree with it for it to work, right? So Jenkins goes on to argue, which suggests that if a kid is already aggressive, they already live in a culture of violence, that video games could conceivably reinforce that level of aggression that they already experience in their environment. But nothing here suggests that a kid who is normal, who's emotionally healthy, who lives in a happy home environment, who has no prior exposure to violence, is likely to become aggressive simply because they play video games. Right? So he's making a distinction there between saying it's really important to take into account context. If you're looking at an example of a violent individual who points to video games as being the reason, then is that really the case? If we have a look at their background, their pre-existing attitudes, their already aggressive tendencies outside of gaming, is video gaming really the catalyst to this? Yet, there are still undeniably in recent years increasing subject of news articles such as this one about video games leading to violence, right? So just as television, comic books, Dungeons and Dragons, heavy metal music, and other spaces in the past have been linked to violent actions of individuals, so too now video games equally have been linked where there's violent or aggressive young behavior, particularly youth, right? So boy 8 watches Grand Theft Auto, shoots Gran, sums it up in terms of this gut reaction to simplify it to a particular text. So I'm mainly interested in, Grand Theft Auto, video games at the moment are being increasingly defined as this. What I think is really interesting in this question is why the focus on youth, right? It's really, the argument is really centered around, particularly Anderson's argument, really centered around young people being the concern. There's less concern around how video games affect adults. Most of the attention is really focused on how children, adolescents, and young adults use video games, right? And here we have an image of the Dunwich Cuckoos, great classic BBC horror film, which kind of maybe sets up the image that some critics of video game use of by children are characterizing. That um, 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 children are. How do you manage a violent child or an aggressive child? Almost defining them as kind of othered or being affected by media content. But, at the same time, I do think there's some really important research around data. Psychologists have found, brain neuroscientists, researchers have found around screen time and engagement. And again, I'd return to Jenkins's idea that certainly if it's outside of a balanced environment, and like anything, if it is of a prolonged period, right, then that is problematic. Like anything, if it's consumed in a kind of binge way, a kind of way which isn't moderated, then yes, it will definitely lead to issues and concerns. But again, is that about kind of willpower and being able to plan and manage life? I think, again, the skills of being able to address screen time are skills to apply generally to life around making sure you have a balanced life. Could be eating chocolate and making sure you do that in moderation. So again, I'm not denying the fact that, yes, we need to define and see through the debate around media effect a set of what are the rules that are being discussed here. I think ultimately media effect is more about a cultural and social tournament of values around what rules we should abide by to hopefully live a fruitful and happy life, right? And unless you've got existing problems, you'll probably be fine. Maybe. Anyway, so Jenkins, I mentioned in the Jenkins quote, he points to the fact that video games haven't really led to a disproportionate increase in violence. So I want to look at this graph for a little bit. So we've got the column which has video games sold to millennials, so that you can see that the bars, right, have been increasing. So the amount of video games that have been sold from 1996 to 2008 in this data indicates increasing upward trends. So more video games are being sold. Right, great. So you'd assume there'd be an increase in violence if Anderson's right in terms of, there's more exposure to video games occurring, that's a risk space, and therefore it's going to lead to more violence. Well, no, as we can see in that line that goes down from just under 200 to 10, youth violence has decreased. At least these figures are from the Ferguson and Kilborn article, showing that, according to these police reports, that the trend is, in fact, the inverse. It's not the case. Why do we still have it? Well, we have debates around it because of really huge articles like this one, right? This is a few years back, The Slender Man, how a horror story became an online urban legend. Not video game, but similar. And in fact, I'd say this is probably an equally interesting case of the quote we started with Douglas Adams, right? A creepy pasta story through various online forums, right? What more foreign toxic space could you imagine for an adult to try and comprehend than the creepy pasta space and this weird Slenderman space? So again, how representative is this of an actual trend that's occurring, right? That creepypasta is to blame, or the Reddit space is to blame, or video games is to blame, if we don't see correlations with actual data like this. I mean, is the best way to approach this question an alternative approach? So, pulling through the arguments a little further, we could see that the underlying reason for this maybe is that younger users are assumed to have, from an adult perspective, a lesser sense of maybe a kind of mature responsibility or judgments around a more, you could use this idea of mature relationship of media content and reality. And ultimately, I think the concern is vulnerable to the effects, right? So again, choosing images here, the kid with the red eyes as a kind of lampooning of the Damien Devil Child that's assumed here. Yeah, what do we really see? And again, I just want to drive home the point that we really do need to look about this in context. This image is not at all COVID-19 friendly, but, people seated close around each other watching friends play a game, probably more realistic in terms of the actual reality of playing a game, in terms of a social space, right? What we're really looking at here is a social space that many people game in, which is again unlikely to necessarily align to a major concern around a specific thing. So, last week I kind of also, spread that idea a little further about video games being something that needs to be understood through context. So there was the Assassin's Creed example, learning about architecture. And this context is important because, as I mentioned, attorney generals have really weighed into this debate within Australia a few years back, before the R18 plus classification got released. Michael Atkinson, the South Australian Attorney General, really held up that debate by just saying, games are a different breed of media and they can't go R+ or have this spike in violence. Again, look at the data. What are the violence police reports saying? Is there an increase in violence since we've had the R rating for games? It would be a great honours project for anyone listening. I'd suspect no, we haven't. So it'd be wonderful to revisit Michael Atkinson's claims around why we shouldn't have had an R-rated classification to see have any of his doom and gloom come true or not. Maybe that's a bit of an unfair project. But nevertheless, again, there's still a continuing public debate around this. Linkages are often drawn if there's a school shooting to the perpetrators of those crimes being linked to a game. Doom, if we're thinking about the Columbine shootings back in 1999. The controversies always continue around this. So you could just type in violent video games or something into the Google News search, and you'll generate a continued flood of links saying there is a media effect that's going down here. What's really interesting, though, is I love things like this where, a site like Kotaku or another website will really actually take these media narratives of a moral panic to task, and, such as this one, break down the absurd anatomy of a video game scare piece. So this is quite an interesting article, which basically deconstructs the type of misrepresentation and bias that went on into this was I forget which US station ran this. Anyway, it was a US station running a piece on the dangers of video games. So again, there's interesting media literacy there from consumers themselves, pushing back against the fear narratives from some news sources. Within this debate, I think the interesting questions to really throw out there are, it does seem like a polarizing debate where you need to decide to believe one side or the other. Ultimately, though, I do feel like everything you need to be directed to weigh the evidence and the credibility of authors of differing studies, and then think of how your own experiences inform the way you think about these type of issues, right? So to draw from experience, firstly. If experience is limited, then move to evidence, and then move to differing studies and authors to hopefully be part and participate in the debate. Both readings that are there in the additional readings, the Anderson and Jenkins one, were chosen to kind of throw that controversial issue into the mix and to raise some important issues around this. It's not necessary to decide one for one or the other, but nevertheless, it does, I think, open up a good debate, right? So to review it, as I pointed out with Anderson, both I think Anderson and Jenkins offer a series of questions about the effects of video games and purport to debunk them, right? So Anderson's also claiming to debunk some of the critics of media effects, and Jenkins also is debunking the supporters of media effect. In the process, they come down to very, very opposite conclusions, which you can read about more in your own time. Anderson's FAQ list draws from his years of studying the relationship of media content and violence of aggression. He references decades of research that finds a link between violence and aggression, and a conclusion that has been, he's testified in front of the U.S. congressional committees. So, it's a space which is, it's probably the debate around media, as we looked at last week with erotic reading, violence, and media. So, it's not surprising it's become the interest in the U.S. culture, at least, of congressional committees. He's interesting in terms of pointing out that less research has examined the concern about violent video games, because video games are only relatively recent in history, with many more immersive video games appearing in the 90s on. And again, this is that kind of, I think the other sources are the Douglas Adams quote we started with, saying, the tendency to criticize disruptive new technology might say more about the critic than the community that's engaged in this sort of disruptive new technology. That is, it might be a fear of simply not understanding a technology, or not understanding the cultural engagement with a technology and feeling alienated from it. Or the point that the Australian Attorney General made, that this material is so different that it does need to be policed. Yet the amount of time spent with games and the high level of engagement by players has led Anderson to fear a relationship between violent video game content and aggressive violent behavior may be enhanced. So ultimately, he's coming down to a much more risk-averse space by saying, well, there might be risk, and therefore we should really be much more critical and concerned with this. So, there's the quote that I flagged that he makes using the metaphor of the cigarette smoker guy. So just to read it, this is considered one of Anderson's core quotes, the argument that the 14-year-old boy arguing that he's played violent video games for years and has never killed anybody is absolutely correct in rejecting the extreme, necessary, and sufficient position. That's the position which says, I'm not violent, I don't feel violent, therefore playing this game isn't going to trigger my violence or make me become violent when I'm not violent. But he goes on to say, the 45-year-old 2-pack-a-day cigarette smoker who notes that he still does not have lung cancer. He's saying that they're equivalent. Both are wrong in inferring that their exposure to the respective risk factors, violent media, cigarettes, in one case or cigarettes in the other, has not causally increased the likelihood that they and people around them will one day suffer consequences of that risky behavior. And that basically boils down Anderson's concern. Again, we could counteract that with Jenkins's arguments that, it's just not showing up in the data, these claims of a risk in terms of the police data doesn't show it. Increased video game sales have been going for the last 20 years. There's no equivalent spike in youth violence. And, a normal kid who's not from aggressive space will not suddenly flip to become aggressive through only playing games. So the challenge that Jenkins is throwing out there is that the dominant media effects paradigm and the call for more complex understanding of teens' relationship needs to occur. And he's arguing that the fantasies of children's culture are an important area to understand how we as a culture are constructing our future, right? So really trying to give some power back to children's culture and the fantasies within that as needing space to actually happen and breathe and be experienced. All right, so there's the Anderson quote. Sorry, I not kind of moved on from that. There's the Anderson quote. If you want to have a look at that briefly. And then the Jenkins position, saying that it does need to be placed in more context to understand what's occurring there. And, in last week's lecture, I kind of tried to run through some points where context is really important. The rabbi that played the Call of Duty game to exercise his fear of Nazis, to empower himself. The dad that played Call of Duty according to the Geneva Convention. and the kid that used the taxi mini mission from Grand Theft Auto, and while it looked like he was being violent by driving over all the pedestrians, was just doing it so he could complete the mission to get the bug of dumb AI, right? The NCPs into the car, right? That they weren't going to get in the car unless he figured out this glitch where you hit them and then they stand up and they get in your taxi to complete the mission. Anyway, the idea that context being really, really significant. So, again, there are many games that you might want to look at to kind of play around with how representative is Call of Duty, really, or Grand Theft Auto anyway, of the gaming space. Goat Simulator, Stanley Parable, Minecraft. All these are really different. In fact, one of the interesting things I think is that a game like Papers, Please is probably more topical and relevant today in a type of border crossing COVID-19 space. So in Papers, Please, you play in a kind of fictional Cold War Eastern Bloc country, and the whole game revolves around you getting passports and identification data and checking against their stories of who they are as to whether or not you allow them to pass through in immigration. And yeah, I think that kind of game equally is interesting. There's a violence, political violence, that's being debated in the background, but yeah, it's a much cleverer idea. So I think defining what we mean by violence, and if there can be a way of engaging with, in this sense, the apparatus of a violent Stalinist type system for engagement. So let's wrap it up there. I hope this has made given you at least a start to think about the topic and to maybe have a look at those readings from Jenkins and Anderson around their claims of the top 10 bullet point lists for violent video games, either making violence or being debunked. So some nice weekend readings for those that might want to kick back and enter the Media Effect Violent campaign. So thanks all for listening, and I'm glad we managed to get through the Twitch stream reasonably well without it falling out. So that's wonderful to see. We'll see next Friday. I'll put together some ideas. We might just take a break because we've got the mid-semester holidays. So yeah, next Friday I'll do something at 4, but it might not be a lecture. It might be something. Maybe I'll play Papers, Please, and enact a reflective experience of bureaucracy and violence. We'll see. Anyway, have a great weekend, and I look forward to next Friday.